In the later years of his life, Ralph Waldo Emerson acknowledged that he was increasingly forgetting things. When things would slip from his mind, he would complain that his memory was being naughty. Sometimes Emerson would forget the names of objects, so in order to speak of them, he would refer to them in a roundabout way. For instance, when he could not recall the word plow, he would call it the implement that cultivates the soil. His greatest struggle was when he began to forget the names of his friends. My grandfather went through a similar struggle as he grew older, and it was tough watching him experience this, especially since my grandfather took great pride in recalling historical events, including the names and even places where important events took place. He would often retell these stories about growing up on the farm and how the town of West Manchester had to rebuild itself essentially from scratch after a lot of young men went to the war and never returned. But as his memories faded, so did this history for younger generations. Except for those of us who cared or heard it so many times, we've locked it into our minds. But even if we wrote what we remember, would anyone care? This specific concern struck me when I was chatting with a number of youth about September 2001. Granted, they were born just a year after that event, yet they had no clue about the significance of that date. They had no idea that we used to wear our shoes when being scanned to fly on an airplane, or that we could even take our own food and drink into the airport. This has me worried about our collective memories regarding COVID. If children continue to wear masks, will they ever recall a time when everyone could play outside or go into a building without having to wear one? Or perhaps the reverse of this is true. When the world experiences another global pandemic, will anyone remember that we were able to hunker down safely at home, or that we prioritized the safety and well being of each other by staying at home or even wearing masks when we went out into public? As I've been contemplating these questions, Memorial Day weekend is upon us, a time when we are encouraged to remember those who died while serving in the armed forces. Unfortunately, we don't tend to see this weekend as an invitation to look at the past, nor tell stories of the past. Perhaps this is due to a failure of memory. This is both true for our modern era as it was true in biblical times as well. Joshua realized that as he led the sojourners toward the promised land, that many of their historical milestones and historical traditions had been forgotten. Attempting to establish a memorial to remind the people what they had experienced once they crossed the River Jordan into the promised land, Joshua ordered the tribes to stop and to take a moment to reflect on the last 40 years of traveling from Egypt to their new location. Granted, many of the original sojourners had died by the time they reached the new land, which is a compelling reason for Joshua to have them go through this exercise. It encouraged families to share the stories of their journey with their children, so it would pass the stories onward to their children. After they recalled the lives of loved ones, he instructed the tribes to choose a representative from their family. And each of these representatives was instructed to take a heavy stone, and together, these stones created a monument that would proclaim to future generations what the people had encountered as they followed God to the promised land. This monument was also meant to serve as a constant reminder that God would continue to remain with them and bless them. Joshua hoped this stone memorial would remind the people of the priests who carried the Ark of the Covenant into the river. And once the water touched their ankles, the water ceased to flow so that the people could cross on dry land. He hoped this memorial would remind the people that they did not cross the desert by themselves, that their deliverance came from God. However, eventually the people suffered memory loss, and God's actions were forgotten as they forgot that God was the one who fed them and delivered them from trouble. Due to their amnesia, the prophets repeatedly insisted that the Hebrews must remember that God was in control and that God had promised Abraham and his descendants safety, greatness, and that God would do great works on their behalf. Yet even with these proclamations, according to Ezekiel and Jeremiah, the people suffered memorial amnesia, as each generation forgot the importance of the memorial and of God's amazing abilities. Neglecting God, these generations failed to recognize that God was in their midst. And despite the words of the prophets, even the generation that made the memorials forgot to ask about the significance of these memorials or what message they proclaim. Still, before we blame any one generation, though, I believe it's important to recall that what one generation values is not always as valued by future generations because the stories are just not shared. Perhaps this is why the prophets repeatedly proclaimed that we ought to tell the stories and do so often. After all, they too recognize that after a while, our memories fade. This may be why Jesus also repeated many of his teachings as he traveled through Galilee or sat to teach his disciples privately. Hearing these repeated lessons, the disciples would internalize his message of seeking God's kingdom first, of loving one another, and serving one another with care. He not only taught these lessons through the use of parables, he also gave the disciples a prayer which highlighted these essential faith elements. Jesus' intent was that his followers would internalize his words and hold them sacred, so that his teachings essentially would become memorials themselves as we passed his lessons and teachings on to others. Passing his teaching on to each generation, we reinforce our faith through the traditions and memorials we hold sacred, informing the present and next generation about our faith traditions, as well as why certain memorials have great significance. And we can inform them in ways that we will adopt our lessons and not forget easily. We must share our stories so that they are not forgotten. And we must share our stories to create hopeful memories. Thankfully, hopeful memories don't drag us into the past and lock us there, nor claim that our best days are already come and gone. Rather, hopeful memories point us toward the future and promise that God has in store for us. The memorials serve as reminders of what God has done in the past with us, and it informs us God will continue to remain with us. The memorials remind us of persons and events in the past, while they also inform us that God is always working for the future. Reviewing the words declared by the prophets, when they proclaim God's actions in the past, this was also done to prepare them for the future. As one author writes, the stories that recalled the past were not told for the past's sake. Rather, these stories were told so that the people would remember the wonders of the past, which would open their minds and lives to the even greater wonders God would do with us and others in the future. With this in mind, and with Memorial Day weekend upon us, it is proper to recall the past and remember those who have left this world, whether in a time of war or in a time of peace. And as we view these memorials built to recall those who have died, we do so not just to recall a time in the past, but we do so in order that we can pay our respects to those who have lived, while also seeing that God saw us through these troubled times. And these hopeful memories remind us that no matter what troubles we encounter, God will be our source of strength and will do incredible things with us, even making the impossible possible. Utilizing this Memorial Day weekend to tell stories and to create memories, we do so with hope that future generations will recall our stories, and collectively, these important stories will not fade. Prayerfully, our stories will be internalized so that they are appreciated. And as people recall the struggles we experienced, most importantly, they will recognize that God remained with us through it all. For we had the strength and support of God with us. And that strength and support remains with us today, as Paul says, declaring, "My life as it has developed after encountering Christ, is a testimony to my character and the believability of the gospel as I have presented it. Interestingly, Paul declared this statement while going through a very rough patch in his life. Still, by internalizing his encounter with Christ, even as he encountered troubles, he remembered that Christ remained with him and faced those troubles with him. Paul was convinced that if we internalize these stories, then when we experience dark alleys or lonely valleys, we will recall that God remains with us. A way to do this is to recall our memorials built to recall God's awesome deeds. And we reinforce these memories by telling our stories. And when we are lost for words or we're not sure where to start, the psalmists offer us the following words, writing, "The voice of the Lord is over the waters. The God of glory thunders. The Lord over mighty waters. The voice of the Lord is powerful. The voice of the Lord is full of majesty." Utilizing these words, we acknowledge that our memories can fade, but sharing our stories with each other, we create memories of hope to prevent a collective memorial amnesia. And thankfully, utilizing this Memorial Day weekend, we are encouraged to tell the stories that have a deep impact on us, not just so our stories are known, but also that those who share them with others understand why these stories are significant to us. As we tell our stories, we remember those who have lived and died, and we recall that God has remained with them, just as God remains with us. Prayerfully, this memory will never fade, and collectively, the actions and love of God will never fade. Amen.